In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. There's a road in Ontario. It doesn't look like much now. Frozen ground, bare trees, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the land itself is holding its breath. But on the night of February the 4th, 1880, that quiet was broken, and 5 people who woke up that morning never saw the sun rise again.
Welcome to Reverberating Noir. I'm Nina Jovovich.
And I'm Adam Jones. Tonight, we're going somewhere most Canadian history books don't. To a farmhouse on a road called the Roman Line, to a family that was erased, and to the community that danced when it was done.
This is the story of the Donnelly family. And before you tell yourself it's ancient history, stay with us. Because the mechanisms that killed them, they're not ancient at all.
Ireland, 1847. The fields are dead. The potatoes have blackened in the soil. Mothers are burying children in unmarked graves while landlords auction their homes from underneath them. James Donnelly and his wife Johannah pack everything they own into a single trunk. They board a ship, they survive the crossing, and they land in Ontario, where the British Crown still rules, and where the Catholic Irish are not exactly welcomed with open arms.
10 years later, the Donnellys have carved something out of nothing. 100 acres of scrubland in Biddulph Township. A home, a family, 7 sons, and a daughter. But here's the first problem. They don't technically own the land. It's disputed. Promised to them by vague squatters' rights, but legally claimed by a man named John Grace. When Grace leases half of it to a man named Patrick Farrell, the powder keg is already packed. All it needs is a spark.
The road they live on is called the Roman Line. That name is not affectionate. It's a slur dressed up as geography. Packed with Irish Catholic immigrants, all fleeing the same nightmare, all trying to build something in a country that viewed their faith as a liability. And the Donnellys, they don't apologise for being there. That, more than anything, is what makes them dangerous in the eyes of their neighbours.
In 1857, James Donnelly kills Patrick Farrell at a barn-raising bee. Now, the details of that night are murky, witnesses disagreed, accounts shifted, but what's clear is this. James is convicted of murder. He's sentenced to hang. And then something remarkable happens.
Johannah, his wife, she doesn't collapse. She doesn't disappear into grief. She gathers signatures. She badgers officials. She turns her desperation into a campaign so relentless that the sentence is commuted. 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary instead of the gallows. When James comes home in 1866, the family has changed, hardened, and the community around them has not forgotten.
This is the part that gets overlooked. The years between the killing and the massacre, nearly 23 years, are not a waiting period. They are an accumulation. The Donnellys run a stagecoach line. They compete aggressively. They win contracts. They refuse to be ashamed of who they are. And in a community built on a fragile social order, that refusal reads as a provocation.
Fires get blamed on them. Livestock goes missing, it's the Donnellys. A fence post is knocked over the Donnellys. Some of it may have been true, some of it almost certainly wasn't. But the truth stopped mattering somewhere along the way. What mattered was the story the community was telling itself. And in that story, the Donnellys were the villains.
By 1879, the tension has curdled into something organized. Father John Connolly, the local priest, starts what he calls a peace society at St. Patrick's Church. On the surface, it sounds like exactly what the community needs. But the peace he's offering has conditions. Members must allow neighbors to search their homes for stolen goods. The Donnellys refuse to sign. And in exercising a right that any person should have, they are immediately recast as people who must have something to hide.
That's the trap, isn't it? Refuse the terms and you're guilty. Accept them and you've surrendered. There is no door in that room that leads anywhere safe.
The Peace Society splinters. What emerges from that fracture is called the Vigilance Committee. led by a man named Constable James Carroll, a local lawman with a badge and a grudge that runs deeper than any river in that county. These men meet in secret. They make lists. They make plans. And they have the blessing, tacit or otherwise, of people who should have known better.
Then a barn burns. Patrick Ryder's barn. No evidence connects the Donnellys to it. None. But Father Connolly dangles a $500 reward for the arsonist and declares from the pulpit that the guilty will be punished. In a community that has already decided who the guilty are, that isn't a call for justice, that's a permission slip.
February the 4th, 1880. The temperature is brutal, the kind of cold that makes the dark feel heavier. More than a dozen men gather at Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse. Farmers, a constable, fathers. They are carrying clubs, axes, pitchforks, and they march toward the Donnelly farmhouse.
Constable Carroll, the man with the badge, uses his authority to make the first move. He arrests James Donnelly and his son Tom, uses the law as a door, and then the mob walks through it.
What happens inside that house we know from one source. A 14-year-old boy named Johnny O'Connor, who was staying the night and hid beneath a bed. He listened. He heard everything.
Johannah Donnelly, the woman who had once moved mountains to save her husband's life, is beaten unconscious. Bridget Donnelly, a niece who had only recently arrived from Ireland, dies on the kitchen floor. Tom Donnelly breaks free and runs into the snow. They chase him. They corner him. And they beat him until there is nothing left to beat.
Then they set the house on fire. Not to destroy the building, to destroy the evidence, to erase the proof that any of this had happened at all.
A second group rides to William Donnelly's home. They shout fire to bring someone to the door. William's brother John steps outside. They shoot him before he can speak. 5 people dead. In a single night, by people who had shared Sunday mornings with them.
And now we get to the part of this story that I think is the most important. Because what happened next is not a footnote. It is the whole point.
Johnny O'Connor survives. He identifies 14 attackers. He takes the stand. He tells everything he heard and saw from underneath that bed. William Donnelly identifies the men who killed his brother John. The evidence exists, the witnesses exist, and it means nothing.
The first jury deadlocks. The second trial is described by observers as rushed, shallow, performative. The Crown Attorney, the man whose job it is to prosecute, reportedly says it's a waste of time and money to pursue charges in a county where everyone already hates the Donnellys. Read that back slowly. A state official. Saying that, out loud.
On February the 3rd, 1881, exactly 1 year after the massacre, all charges are dropped. Every man who walked to that farmhouse with an axe goes home free. And the town throws a dance.
A dance. The men who carried those weapons are toasted as, and I want you to hear this phrase carefully, the redeemers of the community.
The surviving Donnellys live out the rest of their lives in a silence that isn't peace. It's the silence of people who have learned that the world will not protect them. Jenny, the last of the siblings, dies in 1917. And for decades after that, the story is suppressed, whispered about, but never named. Because naming it meant confronting something the community had decided to bury along with the bodies.
Here is the pattern I want you to see. Because this is not just a story about one family on one road in one cold February. The Vigilance Committee didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built from years of institutional indifference. Every time a complaint against the Donnellys was taken more seriously than a complaint from them, that was a signal. Every time a rumor was treated as evidence, that was a signal. Every time the community's comfort was weighed against one family's safety and the family lost, that was a signal. The mob didn't decide to act that night in a vacuum. They had been told, slowly, over decades, that this was acceptable.
And the Crown Attorney, who called the prosecution a waste of time, he didn't invent that calculus. He inherited it. From a system that had been quietly calculating the value of certain lives for a very long time.
This is what I mean when I say the mechanisms aren't ancient. The specific names change. The specific road changes. But the structure, the slow accumulation of permission, the institutional shrug, the community that decides some people are simply not worth the trouble of protecting that structure is not a relic. It is a recurring architecture.
In 2009, 129 years after the massacre, the Lucan Area Heritage and Donnelly Museum opened. Inside, you can see Bridget Donnelly's shawl, James's letters from prison. Johnny O'Connor's testimony, still trembling on the page, it is, as someone once said, not just a memorial, it is a confession.
But here's what still unsettles me. The farmhouse was rebuilt, on the same plot, by people who never knew what the soil beneath them had absorbed. And the descendants of the men who carried those axes, many of them still live in that county. The acquittal is still on the books. No one was ever punished. Not one person.
There's a question I keep coming back to. Not who did this, we know who did this. Not why, we know why. The question I keep turning over is this. At what point did the community decide the Donnellys were not quite people? Because that decision, that quiet, collective, never spoken aloud decision, that is where the real crime begins. Not in the schoolhouse, not on the Roman line. In the space between neighbours, where one family slowly became something other than human in the eyes of the people who shared their road.
And Johnny O'Connor, the boy under the bed, he told the truth. He did everything right. He was 14 years old and he stood up in a courtroom and named the men who had done it. And the system looked at him and looked at the men he was naming and made its choice. He spent the rest of his life knowing exactly what that choice meant.
If you drive the Roman line today, it looks like any other rural road in Ontario. Flat, quiet. The kind of place where nothing seems to have ever happened. That's the thing about erasure done well. It doesn't leave a scar. It leaves a smoothness, a blankness. A road that looks like it was always just a road.
Before we go, there is one detail that I have not been able to set down. Johannah Donnelly, the woman who fought for her husband's life, who raised 7 sons and a daughter in hostile soil, who had survived famine and ocean and a justice system that barely acknowledged her existence. She was beaten unconscious in her own kitchen, and then the house was burned around her. She never regained consciousness. She died without knowing whether any of her children had survived the night. I think about those hands, calloused from farming, scarred from fighting for mercy, and I think about what they were never given the chance to hold.
Some cases close, the files go into boxes, the boxes go onto shelves, the shelves gather dust and the world moves on. This one doesn't close, not because the facts are unresolved, they aren't. We know what happened, we know who did it, we know what the system chose. It doesn't close because the question it asks is still being asked. Every time a community decides that its comfort matters more than someone else's safety, every time an institution looks at the math and decides certain lives don't pencil out, every time we tell ourselves that we would have done differently, the Roman line asks us to be very, very sure about that.
If this episode stayed with you, and I hope it did, please subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you're still thinking about. We find these cases because we believe the stories that were buried deserve to be heard. And there are more of them than anyone wants to admit.
The Donnelly farmhouse burned on February the 4th, 1880. The acquittal came down on February the 3rd, 1881. 1 year, almost to the hour. Justice didn't just fail that family. It looked them in the eye, and it walked away. This is Reverberating Noir. We'll be back in the dark.
The Vigilance Committee was never formally disbanded. It simply stopped meeting. There is no record of any member ever expressing regret. Not one.
The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.